The smell reached me first, not the smell of decay. That comes later in a different kind of encounter, and I have had those too in 41 years of working as a wilderness EMT and search and rescue coordinator in the Klamath Mountains of Northern California. What I was smelling as I worked down the ravine wall that October morning was the smell of a large living animal in distress, which is a specific combination of musk and blood and the particular acrid quality that stress hormones produce in mammalian sweat. I know that smell from search and rescue work, from reaching casualties in rough terrain before anyone else has gotten there, from the first moments of contact with a person who has been injured and alone and afraid for hours. I was not expecting to find a person. I was not expecting to find what I found. Let me tell you about the ravine first, because the ravine is the container for everything that happened, and I want you to understand what kind of place it is. The Klamath Mountains in the far north of California are old country, some of the oldest exposed geology in the western United States. The ridgelines steep and the drainages deep. The old-growth mixed conifer holding the slopes above the creek bottoms in a canopy that has been continuous in some sections for more than 200 years. The specific ravine I was working into that morning was off-trail, a drainage I had been down twice before on SAR call-outs where subjects had fallen into it or been found near its upper edge. It is roughly 100 feet deep at its narrowest point, the walls steep enough that you need your hands on the way down, the creek at the bottom running fast in October from the first rains. My name is Douglas Farr. I am 62 years old and I have been doing search and rescue coordination in the Klamath region for 22 years and wilderness emergency medicine for 41. Before the coordination work, I was a field responder. And before that, I was a paramedic. And before that, I was a kid from Siskiyou County who grew up in this specific kind of country and never found a compelling reason to leave it. I have a working knowledge of the Klamath that is not academic. It is the knowledge of someone who has been called into every type of terrain this region produces, in every season, under every weather condition, to find people who are hurt or lost or both. I know this country. That is the foundation on which everything I am about to tell you rests. I know it the way I know the inside of a chest cavity, or the anatomy of a compromised airway, through long applied consequential practice that does not leave room for wishful thinking or comfortable imprecision. I was in the ravine that morning on my own time, not a call-out. I had hiked in the previous afternoon and camped at the top of the drainage for reasons that were personal rather than professional. I go into the backcountry alone several times a year, have done since my 20s, for the specific quality of attention it requires and produces. The Klamath in October is after the first rains and before the serious cold, the air sharp, the creek bottoms smelling of wet stone and alder and the last of the salmon run. I had heard something in the night that I could not account for. A sound from the ravine below my camp, low and distressed, the specific quality of a large animal in pain. And in the morning I went down to find out what it was. That is the decision I have examined more than any other decision in my life. And I have had a long working life that has included many decisions made in urgent circumstances. Going down the ravine wall toward a sound I could not identify was, by the protocols I enforce in search and rescue work, not the correct decision for a solo responder with no backup and no communication with a team. I knew that when I made it, and I made it anyway. And I have been honest with myself about why. Because the sound in the night had the quality of suffering, and 41 years of wilderness emergency medicine has conditioned me to move toward that quality rather than away from it. It is not a choice I make consciously. It is what my nervous system does. I smelled the animal before I could see it. The ravine wall put me at an angle to the creek where the drainage curved, and the curve meant the lower section was not visible until I was most of the way down. I had my pack on my back with a full trauma kit. I do not go into the backcountry without one. and my attention was split between the descent and the smell, which was getting stronger as I came down and which was telling me animal, large, alive, stressed, and something else that I could not categorize immediately. A quality in the musk that was outside my reference range. I know black bear smell. I know mountain lion smell, which is different and specific and distinctive enough that you know it immediately when you encounter it close up. What I was smelling had elements of both without being either, and that specific combination, familiar components in an unfamiliar ratio, was the first thing that told me this was not going to be an ordinary morning. I came around the curve of the ravine wall and I saw it. It was at the base of the far wall, in the shadow of an overhang of old-growth Douglas fir root that had grown over the ravine edge above and hung exposed for 20 feet before disappearing back into the soil. A large animal, dark, lying on its side with one leg extended in a way that my paramedic's eye read immediately as wrong. The specific angle of a limb that has suffered a fracture or severe soft tissue damage. The extension that comes when the surrounding musculature can no longer maintain normal resting position against the weight of the limb itself. I stopped on the ravine wall with my feet braced on the last descent, and I looked at what was at the base of the far wall, and I did not move for what I estimate was 2 minutes. I was looking at a sasquatch. I do not use that word casually. I have used it exactly twice in my life. Once in the field notebook I keep for anything that requires documentation, and once now, here, telling you this. In the field it is clinical language for an unknown. The way a paramedic says possible cardiac event before the diagnosis is confirmed. But here, telling you 11 years later, I am going to use the word because it is the accurate word, and I have arrived at a point in my life where the accurate word is what I owe the account. It was approximately 8 feet long from head to heel in its lateral position, which I estimated by reference to the overhang root above it that I knew from the previous call-out to extend approximately 22 feet. The body was covered in dark brown hair that appeared matted on the left side where it was in contact with the ground, and which showed moisture. Rain from the night before or exudate from the injury I could not tell from the wall. The right leg was the extended one, the wrong-angled one, and even at this distance I could see swelling above what I was reading as the equivalent of a human mid-femoral region, upper thigh, a serious injury at a location that in a human would threaten the femoral artery and require aggressive intervention. It knew I was there. I cannot tell you the exact moment of mutual awareness. I was watching it, and there was a period in which it was not watching me, and then there was a period in which it was, and the transition between those two periods was a shift in the quality of the stillness rather than a visible movement. The head turned toward me. I was looking at its face from a distance of approximately 40 feet from above in the shadow of the ravine. I am not going to try to describe the face in detail. I have tried in the field notebook, and what I produced was clinical and inadequate and did not capture what the face communicated to me from 40 feet in the shadow of the ravine. What I will say is that the expression, and I use that word deliberately as someone who has read injury response in faces for 41 years, the expression was pain and awareness and the specific quality of something that has been alone with an injury for long enough that the acute fear has passed, and what remains is the steady, exhausted management of the fact of the pain. I have seen that expression on human faces in the field. I have seen it on the faces of people who have been injured and alone for many hours before we reached them. I knew what I was looking at. I knew it without equivocation, which is the only kind of knowing that functions in an emergency. And what I knew was, this animal is seriously injured and has been alone with that injury overnight and is in the specific physiological state that comes after the acute phase, the state that precedes either recovery or deterioration, the state that requires an intervention decision. I did not know what intervention was available to me. That is the honest truth of the next 10 minutes. Standing on the ravine wall with my pack and my trauma kit and 41 years of training and the knowledge that none of that training had a protocol for this situation. I ran through what I had. A femoral region injury in a biped is a specific threat profile, potential vascular involvement, significant blood loss risk, fracture or severe tissue damage requiring immobilization and evacuation. In a human, I would have been down that wall in 30 seconds. I would have been assessing the injury, controlling any bleeding I could access, splinting what could be splinted, calling for a team, beginning the chain of intervention that my training was designed to produce. In this situation, I stood on the wall for 10 minutes and thought. What I was thinking about was the injury. But I was also thinking about what it meant to go down the wall toward a seriously injured large animal of unknown temperament and unknown response to human proximity. In search and rescue work, there is a concept called scene safety. The assessment you make before you approach any casualty about whether the environment or the casualty itself represents a threat to the responder. You do not approach until you have assessed. Going down the wall toward an injured sasquatch was a scene safety problem of a kind I did not have a protocol for. What I was also thinking about underneath the clinical assessment was the quality of the expression on its face and the sound I had heard in the night, and the specific texture of the smell that was still reaching me on the ravine air, and what all of those things together implied about what was at the base of the far wall. Something large and intelligent and seriously hurt, alone overnight in a Klamath ravine, that had heard me coming down the wall and had turned its head to look at me and had not, in the 2 minutes I had been visible to it, shown any sign of aggression or fear or the attempt to move away that most injured wild animals produce when a human approaches. It was watching me the way a person watches someone who has found them. Not with the animal's instinct to flee or defend, with something more like, and I choose this word from 41 years of being the person who comes when something has gone wrong. Recognition. The recognition of someone who has been alone with a bad situation and has just heard footsteps on the approach. I went down the rest of the wall. I am not going to tell you the decision was made with clinical clarity because it was not. It was made with the part of me that is a paramedic first and a protocol follower second. And the paramedic looked at the face and the extended leg and the matted fur and made the decision before the protocol follower had finished the scene safety analysis. I went down and I crossed the creek on the flat stones and I came to within 15 feet and I stopped. Everything in my training said, assess before you touch. So I assessed. The injury was to the right upper thigh. The swelling was significant and diffuse. Not the sharp localized swelling of a puncture wound, but the broader spread of a hematoma which suggested either a severe contusion from an impact or a fracture with surrounding blood pooling. I was looking at it through matted fur, which limited what I could see, but the shape of the swelling and the angle of the extended limb were consistent with a mid-shaft femoral region injury in a human that is a serious injury profile. Potential vascular involvement given the proximity of the femoral artery, blood loss risk, fracture or severe soft tissue damage requiring immobilization and careful evacuation. In this situation, I did not have immobilization equipment appropriate to the scale of what I was looking at, and I did not have an evacuation team. And the anesthetic and surgical intervention that a femoral region fracture ultimately requires was not something I could provide in the bottom of a Klamath ravine. What I had was a trauma kit with cold packs and compression material and pain management options designed for human physiology and likely inappropriate for whatever physiology was in front of me. I ran through what I had, and I categorized the intervention available to me as limited, directed at symptom management, and unlikely to cause harm if applied carefully. The animal was breathing in the specific managed pain pattern. Shallow, controlled, with the slight breath hold at the peak of each inhalation that is the autonomic response to movement against an injured structure. not the shallow, rapid breathing of shock. The managed pattern. It had been in the ravine overnight with this injury, and it was past the acute phase and into the endurance phase, which in a human I would interpret as a reasonable physiological reserve. It did not move while I assessed. I was 15 feet away, kneeling on the creek gravel with my hands on my thighs and my pack open behind me, looking at the injury, and it lay with its head turned toward me, and it did not move. Its eyes were open. It was watching me assess it. I do not know how to describe the quality of that watching except to say that it was not the watching of an animal that does not understand what a human kneeling nearby and looking at it means. It was the watching of something that was allowing me to look. I have been allowed to assess injuries by frightened, injured people many times. The specific quality of the permission, the stillness that is not paralysis but is a choice, the openness to scrutiny that comes from someone who needs help and has decided to let the help happen. I have felt it many times as a working paramedic. What I was feeling in the bottom of that ravine, kneeling 15 feet from something I could not name, was the same quality of permission. I want to be careful here about what I say next, because what I say next is the part of this account that I have been most careful about in 11 years of carrying it. And the part that matters most to what I said the account taught me that I did not want to know. I reached into my trauma kit and I took out a cold pack, the kind you crack to activate, used for acute injury to reduce swelling and pain. And I cracked it. The sound of the crack in the quiet ravine was significant, and the animal reacted to it. A small flinch, the head lifting slightly, the body tensing in the way a body tenses when it is already in pain and a new stimulus arrives. I froze. The tension held for a moment. Then it released and the head lowered and the animal was still again. I moved forward, not quickly. The pace you use when you are approaching something that you need to not startle and that has already shown you it can tolerate your presence. 10 feet. 8. At 6 feet I stopped and I extended the cold pack toward the injury site slowly, and I held it there. The animal looked at my hand. It looked at the cold pack. It looked at my face. Then it shifted its weight slightly. A small movement, the kind a person makes when they are trying to make something easier for you to reach, and the injured thigh moved fractionally toward me. I placed the cold pack against the injury site. I held it there. The animal was still. I held the cold pack against an injured sasquatch in the bottom of a Klamath ravine for approximately 20 minutes, kneeling on the creek gravel. And what I was doing for most of those 20 minutes was breathing and trying to process what the small movement of the injured thigh had communicated. Because the movement was not random. It was not the reflex response of pain which moves away from the stimulus, not toward it. What had happened was deliberate and small and unmistakable to someone who has spent 41 years reading the body language of injured people in extremis. The animal had understood that I was trying to help it and had cooperated with that help. It understood the gesture and it responded to it. Across a gap that should not be crossable between a human paramedic and an unknown large primate in a California ravine, something was communicated and received and acted upon. That is what I did not want to know, not that the animal was real. I had no doubt about that from the moment I came around the curve of the ravine wall. Not that it was injured. The evidence of that was immediate and clear. What I did not want to know was what the small movement of the thigh toward the cold pack implied about the cognitive and social capacity of the animal I was kneeling beside. Because if it understood the gesture, if it recognized assistance being offered and chose to facilitate the assistance, then everything I thought I knew about the boundary between human social cognition and the cognition of other animals needed revision. And revising that boundary is not a comfortable process for a person who has spent 41 years working in a professional context that depends on it. I was in the ravine for approximately 4 hours. I rotated the cold packs as each activation was spent, working through 4 packs total from my kit. I had 2 more that I kept in reserve in case the situation changed in a direction that required them. The animal remained still throughout, breathing in the managed pain pattern, watching me with an attention that did not vary in its quality across those 4 hours. Not wary, not resigned, not the unfocused gaze of an animal in advanced shock. Simply present and attentive, the quality of attention you see in a person who is in significant pain and managing it and is aware of what is happening around them. I talked occasionally, not at length, short, low statements of the kind I use in field medicine with conscious casualties, brief descriptions of what I was doing before I did it, spoken in a tone calibrated to be non-threatening. I am going to rotate this pack now. That sounds like it is working. You are going to be all right. I do not know if the words communicated anything. The tone, I think, communicated something. The animal's breathing pattern modulated slightly in the second hour. A fractional deepening, a slight decrease in the frequency of the breath hold, in a way I read as reduced acute stress response. I am aware that reading is a projection, and I note it as such. I am also a paramedic with 41 years of reading physiological response in field conditions, and I noted it in the field notebook, and I stand behind the note. In the third hour, it allowed me closer. Not through any invitation I could identify. No gesture, no sound. What happened was I shifted forward on the creek gravel slightly, closing the distance from 6 feet to about 4, and the animal did not withdraw and did not tense. That is the field medicine version of tolerance. You test the boundary by moving it, and if the boundary moves without protest, you work at the new distance. I worked at 4 feet for the rest of the third hour and most of the fourth. At 4 feet, I could see the injury more clearly. The swelling was concentrated in a band approximately 8 inches long at what I was reading as the mid-thigh equivalent, and the outer surface of the fur at the injury site had a faint discoloration I interpreted as superficial bruising showing through. The deep purple of fresh hematoma at the subcutaneous level. The injury was consistent with a significant impact, possibly a fall from height into the ravine. The walls above the base were steep enough that a fall from the upper section would produce exactly this injury profile in a large biped. Something had fallen into this ravine and had been lying at the base of the overhang root since at least the previous night. It had not died. It had not self-evacuated. It had been managing the situation alone until I came down the wall. Toward the end of the fourth hour, the animal moved. Not the injured limb and not suddenly. The body as a whole began a slow repositioning, a process that took perhaps 10 minutes. The movement incremental and careful in the way of something that has learned exactly which movements produce more pain and which produce less. I watched without intervening, my hands visible, the last cold pack still against the injury site. The repositioning told me several things. The injury was not a femoral fracture with active vascular involvement, because the movement did not produce the physiological signs of vascular compromise I had been watching for across 4 hours. No change in skin color at the extremity. No drop in the responsiveness of the attention. The pain was real and significant, but the immediate life threat I had assessed at the outset was not what was presenting. Whatever the injury was, the 4 hours of cold application and reduced inflammation had done the work that cold application and reduced inflammation can do. It got to its feet, slowly, incrementally, one movement at a time. The right leg waited last and waited carefully. When it was fully upright, I revised my height estimate upward, 9 feet, perhaps slightly more, a body with the mass of something that had been lying at the base of that overhang root and had compressed the gravel in a way that my own weight would not have approached. It stood on the creek gravel 5 feet from me, and it looked at me from that height for 30 seconds. Maybe slightly longer. I had stopped tracking time closely. Then it turned and walked north along the creek bottom. slowly with a limp that favored the right leg, but that was a walk and not a struggle. And it went around the curve of the drainage and was gone. I sat on the creek gravel for a long time after it was gone. What I sat with was not what I expected to sit with. I have been in enough field situations that I know what the aftermath of acute stress feels like in the body. The shaking hands, the racing heart, the specific crash of stress hormones releasing when the situation that generated them has resolved. I had some of that, but what was louder was something else, something quieter and more persistent that I have tried to name accurately and have not fully succeeded. What I had was a sense of having done work that was familiar in its structure and strange in its specific content. I had assessed an injury. I had provided the intervention available to me. I had stayed with the patient until the immediate crisis resolved and the patient demonstrated the ability to self-evacuate. I had done, in other words, exactly what I have spent 41 years doing in every other field context. The specific nature of the patient was different from anything in my 41 years. The work was exactly the same. I thought about that for a long time on the creek gravel. The work being the same felt like important information, and I was not sure yet what it was important to. I climbed out of the ravine in the late afternoon, the climb harder than the descent had been because my legs were tired from 4 hours of kneeling on creek gravel and the walls were wet from the afternoon moisture coming in off the Pacific. I went back to my camp and I made food and ate it without tasting it, and then I sat in the camp chair and I wrote in the field notebook for 2 hours. I wrote everything I could reconstruct with the precision my training requires. The physical description of the animal in full, the injury assessment with differential diagnosis noted, the timeline from descent to self-evacuation, the cold pack application sequence and the animal's physiological responses to each rotation, the movement of the thigh toward the cold pack with the time stamp and the exact nature of the movement, the final repositioning sequence, the standing, the walk north. I wrote it in the clinical format I have used for 41 years, presenting conditions, observable events, measurements and estimates with confidence levels, interventions applied and responses noted. Outcome. I read it back twice. It was a complete and accurate account of what had happened. Then I wrote one more line at the bottom, which is not clinical format and which I have kept private until now. It knew I was trying to help, and it let me. Those 2 sentences are the distillation of what the 4 hours produced, that the clinical account cannot contain. The clinical account is true. Those 2 sentences are also true. They are true in a way that is harder to sit with than the clinical account because the clinical account does not require me to revise anything about what I thought I knew. And those 2 sentences require me to revise quite a lot. I hiked out the following morning on legs that were stiff from the ravine work and a mind that was still processing in the background the way a mind processes something it has not yet finished with. The trail out took longer than usual. I did not mind. I have told this account in full to 3 people in the 11 years since. The first was my wife Constance, who was not yet my ex-wife when it happened. We separated 4 years after for reasons that had nothing to do with the ravine, though I sometimes wonder whether the person who came home from that trip was different enough from the person Constance had married that the separation was already latent in what the October morning produced. She responded to the account the way she responded to most difficult things, which was with practical questions. What was the ambient temperature in the ravine? What was your assessment of the animal's hydration status? Did you observe any respiratory distress beyond the managed pain breathing pattern? She asked good questions and she did not express disbelief, and she said at the end, "I think you did the right thing going down." I said, "I know I did." She said, "That is all you need." She was right about that, and she was right about a great many other things, and I am sorry about the ways I was not right enough in return. The second was a wilderness medicine colleague in Medford. a physician who has worked high-angle rescue in the Klamath and who has the specific credibility that comes from having seen enough of what this country can produce to have a realistic framework for unusual events. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he said, "What you are describing in the injury response and the tolerance of proximity is consistent with the documented attributes of great ape social cognition, specifically the capacity for what primatologists call prosocial behavior, the ability to recognize assistance being offered by a non-kin individual and to cooperate with it." He said, "I do not think you are wrong about what you observed." I said, "I know I am not wrong." He said, "Yes, I can see that." The third was a researcher named Aldous Whitby, who works the Klamath documented record and who came to my house with a copy of the field notebook. I had given him a copy, not the original, and sat at my kitchen table and went through it page by page with the attention that a careful person brings to a document they understand is significant. Aldous said the Klamath Mountains have a documented record going back to the 1920s. And that the specific drainage I had been working in had 2 prior documented accounts in his files, both involving the sound of distressed vocalization from the Ravine system, neither with a visual confirmation. He said the description of the injury response, the tolerance of proximity, the cooperative movement, the 4 hours of sustained contact, was outside anything in the documented encounter record he was aware of. He said, "What you are describing is the most direct documented example of intentional cooperation between a human and one of these animals that I have encountered." I said, "I am not certain cooperation is the right word." He said, "What word would you use?" I thought about it and I said, "Recognition." He said, "Yes, that is probably the more accurate word, recognition." The Stizales First Nation of British Columbia have documented oral tradition of sasquatch going back centuries, and their accounts consistently describe the being as something that exists in relationship with the land and with the people who live on that land. Not an animal in the Western taxonomic sense, not a person in the Western legal sense, but something that occupies a category the Western framework does not have a clean slot for. I read those accounts after the ravine. I read them differently than I would have read them before the ravine. The category problem felt familiar. I retired from field response 3 years ago. I still do coordination work. I still go into the Klamath backcountry alone several times a year, and I still carry a full trauma kit, and I still go towards sounds in the night that a more prudent person might leave alone. What has changed is the quality of my attention when I am in that country. I listen differently. I look at the deep ravines differently. The Klamath Mountains are old country, and they hold old things, and whatever used that ravine drainage for cover while it healed is probably still in that drainage, and when I am in the country above it, I am aware of that in a way I was not aware of anything in those drainages before October of the year I went down the wall. The cold packs I used are in a ziplock bag in the gear cabinet in my garage. I kept them because they are physical evidence that I was in that ravine for 4 hours providing emergency care to something I cannot classify in any professional category available to me. And the physical evidence is the only anchor the account has to a reality that does not require my memory to be perfect. My memory of the movement of the thigh, though, is perfect. I have checked it against itself many times in 11 years. It does not change. The injured thigh moved fractionally toward the cold pack, not away, toward. I know what that means. It means what I said it means, and it means what I did not want it to mean, and it means what it means regardless of my wanting. I am still working out what to do with it. The cold packs in the ziplock in the garage are physical evidence that I spent 4 hours in a Klamath ravine providing emergency care to something I cannot classify in any professional category available to me. And some mornings I go into the garage and I look at the bag, and I think about the specific small movement that produced those 2 sentences at the bottom of the field notebook entry. and I think about what the movement meant and what it implies and whether I am prepared to accept all of what it implies or only the parts that are comfortable. I am not prepared to accept only the parts that are comfortable. That is not how I was trained, and it is not who I am. And the uncomfortable parts are the parts that are most true. The Klamath Mountains are old country. Whatever lives in their deep drainages has been living there for longer than any record available to me can reach, and it is living there still. And the old country holds it the way old country holds things, completely and without much concern for whether the holding is acknowledged by the people who walk through it. I expect I will be working on what that means for the rest of my time in this country.